The Dan A4-SFX was one of the original small form factor cases for gaming PCs, and it was really the case that kickstarted this trend of sub 10 liter sandwich layouts with two separate compartments for your hardware. And today, Dan and Lian Li are announcing a new case. It's called the Dan A4-H2O. As the name suggests, you can kind of think of this case as like a Dan A4, but with much larger liquid cooling support, and it also supports slightly larger graphics cards as well. Turns out this case is the smallest case that I've reviewed that supports a 240mm liquid cooler with a pair of full-sized fans. Not to mention, pricing here is quite a bit better than you'd expect, a lot better than the smaller original Dan A4. But a lot has changed in the gaming PC industry since the first revision of the Dan A4. There are a lot more space-optimized cases to choose from, graphics cards are now much larger, and cooling demands have increased as well. So let's take a look at what you need to know about the new Dan A4-H2O, what kind of thermal performance you can expect, what kind of system I'd recommend building inside this, and how it compares to your other choices out there. So Lian Li actually sent this over as part of their digital expo that they're running today. Link will be down in the description if you want to check that out. But this is a case that they're aiming to launch in Q3 of this year. So let's see if it's really worth waiting for. Starting with the exterior, it's exactly what you'd expect from Lian Li. In fact, it feels a touch more premium than the original Dan A4 and the Ncase M1, which Lian Li also produce. The case is entirely aluminium, but the surface finish this time is a lot smoother, which I prefer. It's visually very similar to the finish on the formed T1. In fact, if you're familiar with the formed T1, these two cases share quite a lot in common depending on which layout of the T1 you're planning to use, but more on that towards the end. At around 10.5 liters, it's about 3 liters larger than the original Dan A4 and about 2 liters smaller than an Ncase M1. At this point, you've got some really hard choices to make between these cases and the realistically small volumes that separate them. Now, as for that riser cable, Lian Li have told me that they'll be shipping the Dan A4-H2O for $120 US with a Gen 3 riser, but there will also be a Gen 4 riser option for around $30 to $40 more. For those of you who aren't aware, PCIe Gen 3 risers are increasingly becoming a big problem as both motherboards and GPUs move towards PCIe Gen 4. My friends over at Hardware Canucks actually did a great video on this where they show how frustrating and unpredictable PCIe Gen 3.0 risers can be when using a Gen 4 GPU and motherboard. I'll link that video down below, but for the new Dan A4-H2O, I'd absolutely recommend paying the extra cash for the Gen 4 riser. Even with it, it is cheaper than the regular Dan A4 and within about $10 of the subbed Meshlicious, which also offers Gen 3 or Gen 4. Now for GPUs, cards up to 305mm in length and 150mm in height, including the power connectors, will fit here, but card thickness is a lot more complicated. I measured 50mm of clearance, which means exactly 2.5 slot cards will be touching the side panel, but for cards that are between 2 and 2.5 slots, they'll be fine. So take this Sapphire Pulse RX 5600 XT for example. The shroud overhangs the I/O bracket by a few millimeters, but there's still some decent clearance before the side panel in the Dan A4-H2O. So long story short, 50mm is the absolute limit. Ideally, don't be installing cards thicker than around 47mm. And an important note for flow-through cooler designs, you'll typically want to avoid them for sandwich layout cases which can't accommodate ample breathing room between the flow-through fan and the power supply. This, unfortunately, is one of those cases. We'll take a look at the testing for that in just a moment. Now, in terms of the build process, it went a lot better than I was expecting. The first thing that you'll want to do is install your 240mm radiator and fans. That involves removing the power supply bracket and the radiator bracket on that side. This is where I encountered the strict radiator compatibility for this case. Not all 240mm radiators are going to fit. The NZXT Kraken X53, for example, is 123mm in width, so I couldn't get it fully installed, but then the Fantex 240 MPH was no issue at all since it's exactly 120mm in width. So with the AIO positioned this way, the fans will be drawing air in through the side panels and exhausting it out the top. Lining up the fan screws is a bit tricky because you don't have much visibility or wiggle room here, but once you get a couple of them installed, the rest line up nice and easy. I then installed the motherboard, then the SFX power supply, which took a couple of steps, but overall pretty straightforward, and then finally the graphics card. Also, the bottom panel is removable to give you full access to cable routing, which I found very helpful. I will also note that this is completely blocked, there's no ventilation on that bottom panel, but the case does sit very low anyway. In the end, you can get a really clean and tidy looking build in the Dan A4-H2O, but how does it actually perform? Well, in terms of CPU cooling, performance is really good. At 1100 RPM, we're getting thermal and noise performance about even with the Ncase M1, but performance scales a bit better once we increase the fan speed. That's likely due to a more efficient airflow path. We can also see the direct difference between slim fans versus full thickness fans between the Form T1 and the Dan A4-H2O. There's about 6 degrees between them, although the Dan case is a touch louder. VRM thermals are also in check, seeing as there is a fan directly above the motherboard's VRM, and again we do see some good scaling here with the increased fan speed and airflow. As for GPU thermals, they're also quite good for a sandwich layout case, 1 degree better than the Form T1. However, this is with a 2-slot RTX 2070 Super Founders Edition, which isn't truly fair to some of the other cases in this chart, which can accommodate larger graphics cards with more cooling. So just keep that in mind. For now, this is the best that we can do for comparing a single GPU among a range of cases, but context matters. For cases that can accommodate larger graphics cards, you will get better results. And as suspected, the flow-through cooler design of the RTX 3080 Founders Edition is not a good pairing with this case at all. There's very limited clearance between that flow-through fan and the power supply, and unfortunately the radiator fans aren't enough to overcome all of that trapped heat. So overall, the Dan A4-H2O is looking like a really solid case, especially at the $160 or so price tag with a Gen 4 PCIe riser cable. And I've made a lot of comparisons in this review against the T1 and the Ncase M1, because at around 10.5 liters, that's kind of where this case lines up and is competing against. But one area where those cases are significantly better is when it comes to flexibility. Whether you want to go for full air cooling or with an AIO setup or maybe even a full custom loop, you can do an almost infinite number of system configurations in those cases, not to mention they do have triple slot graphics card support. So I really do like the Dan A4-H2O, but it feels like a very rigid case where you're kind of locked into doing this single approach. What it really should be compared to here is the SUPT Meshlicious, because although the sizes are a bit different, about 10 liters versus roughly 14 liters, the systems that you're going to be building in either one will be very similar, as is the price point. Personally, I do think the Meshlicious is still the case to beat in 2021, but then a lot of it does come down to personal preference. The Dan A4-H2O is a lot more minimal and elegant looking, build quality is also better, and maybe you've got your hands on a slimmer graphics card and don't need that thicker graphics card support. At the end of the day, the choice is yours, but I'm really interested to hear what you think about this case down below in the comments. As always, a huge thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.